And welcome back for another edition of Arizona LGBTQ plus Storytime Community History. So happy that you can join us today. And so I am your host, Marshall Shore, and I'm bringing on my co-host, Jasmine. Hello. How are you?
I am great. How are you?
I'm great. So I always want to give a little plug off to Phoenix Office of Arts and Culture for their support in this, as well as South Mountain Storytelling Institute. So appreciate them as well. Now, this is brought to you by the Arizona LGBT plus History Project. That is a collaboration between Phoenix Pride, ASU Libraries, the BJ Budd Collection, and myself. And I always love to give a little, just kind of a shout out to Tucson, who started our first newsletter by and for the queer community back in 1976. And I think it'll come up as we talk a little bit about some drag history in Arizona. And I just want to give a shout out to William Gause, who was our first official female impersonator in Arizona that we can document back in 1894 down in Tombstone. He was part of a minstrel troupe traveling through. And our first local drag queen, Mr. Butterfield, performed back in 1904 at East Lake Park. Now, without any further ado, I want to bring on David Boyles. Hello, David.
Hello.
And how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. How about y'all?
Can't complain. It's lovely sitting here in the air conditioning.
Exactly. I haven't been outside all day, so it's been great.
So I woke up last week with a moment where the AC wasn't working, but luckily was able to get that fixed quite quickly. So David, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I teach at ASU. I'm a writing instructor at ASU at the Tempe campus. I've been there for actually 9 years already. I'm going on 10 pretty soon. I teach writing. I also teach a special topics class for our freshmen in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences every fall called LGBTQ Youth in Pop Culture and Politics, where we look at the history of how LGBTQ youth have been represented both in culture, film, movies, things like that, and also the history of LGBT youth and sort of political discussions, which is every year I teach it, becomes more and more of a relevant topic, with things going on. And then I'm also one of the founders and on the board of directors of Drag Storyhour Arizona, our local chapter of Drag Storyhour, which we started here in Arizona in 2019. We just had our 5-year anniversary in February. And I'm also, it's great. It's very strange to be 5 years already, since 2 of them were, during a pandemic. We were only doing events online. And I'm also involved in the National Drag Storyhour Network, our national nonprofit organization, which, works to support all the local chapters. And I'm actually the board president of the Drag Storyhour National. I took that office last July and been working to build up our national organization. We just hired a great new executive director, and we've got big plans happening at the national level as well. And I'm also, someone who's very passionate about LGBT history, has done a lot of, events out in the community, especially about drag history, working with Felicia Miner, who's one of the drag performers who works with us at Drag Storyhour. We've done an art of drag presentation at Burton Bar Library and Chandler Public Library and some other places. And I'm also my second Pride Month now, doing LGBT history events at Brick Road Coffee in Tempe to celebrate Pride Month. That's about it.
And trying to sleep amongst some of those events as well. So
I mean, you're one to talk on that.
Well, it's such important work that we keep history in front of folks. I mean, otherwise, as they say, I mean, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And, especially LGBT history, because it is generally not taught in schools, especially here in Arizona, coming out of the Arizona public school system. I think most people do not get any sort of LGBT history. And so I know a lot of, I work with college students a lot. I know a lot of, college age and young LGBT people, and even like older people who, were not taught this history and are very, fascinated and want to learn more, and are very angry when they learn about all the important LGBT history that they did not learn about in school. So yeah, that's why I love talking about all of this, and I love all the work that you've been doing on this front here.
Yeah, and I think to your point, I think that's why it's important that we talk about the fact that those first LGBTQ newspapers and locally were in 76.
Mm-hmm.
So everything before that is just oral history or trying to piece together what we can.
Right.
So
yeah, exactly. That's something. And then because of that, you have the idea that there is no LGBT history.
Right.
And yeah, I'm going like, no, it just was not written down or preserved. And there are reasons for that. And you see that especially now with so much of the political discourse around trans issues, this idea that trans people and trans children in particular are like this new thing that have not existed before. When, literally we do have scant, but do have records of, trans children, in the early 20th century, 100 years ago. So yeah, the more we can recognize that, the more it undercuts all of these arguments that like this is all brand new and
Right.
just coming out of nowhere.
Yeah, that's I've had several friends come to me after we started really talking about Nikolai Duralin, the 1906 Russian gender pioneer. And they were like, it's like, thank you for that, because it's like my parents thought it was just trendy and that's what I was doing. And being able to showcase that trans people have been around long before it became trendy,
Right.
quote unquote.
Right.
And is it trendy?
Yeah, exactly. So that idea that,
is that really something that people are choosing to do, to be like in a body that is targeted and at a time like this?
Yeah, there's this idea that coming out of trans is the trendy popular thing, and everyone's just gonna like celebrate and throw glitter when you come out as trans. And once again, like anywhere, I think that's ridiculous, but especially in Arizona, so yeah.
Definitely.
So what type of things, so when you're teaching at ASU about kind of queer youth and pop culture, what kind of things are you touching on?
So it's been really interesting because I started doing that class actually in 2019, right around the time we founded Drag Storyhour, or Drag Storyhour Arizona, because it was something I was interested in. And over the last 5 years, since I've been teaching that class, like I mentioned earlier, like it has just become more and more politically relevant with the attacks on queer and especially trans kids, with the Don't Say Gay laws in Florida, with the attacks on us at Drag Storyhour, and then right up to the point of I think Marshall, you're aware of what happened with me last fall on the ASU campus, being attacked by Turning Point USA, an anti-hate group, which was exactly the stuff we're talking about in class, which was very, the conversation I had with the students after that was very interesting, because it was, illustrating everything we've been talking about. So in terms of the class, again, I try to start with history. That's something I've, as I've done the class and sort of played with how to present things and how to organize things in the class. I generally start with history. I often start by showing the students, are you familiar with the film Boys Beware, the educational film from the 60s?
Indeed. It's a classic, especially seen through modern lenses.
Yeah, it's a classic from this guy named Sid Davis, who was like the impresario of these, educational films that were shown in schools, that, hit on every moral panic of the time of stranger danger and drugs, and
oh my goodness.
Yeah, I made all the films where the kids like try marijuana for the first time and go crazy and start murdering people and things like that. And yeah, there's a film called Boys Beware, which is basically presents all adult gay men as predators who are preying on, as it's aimed obviously at middle schoolers, at like preteen boys. And so we start with that, and then we move into talking about Anita Bryant and the Save Our Children campaign in the 70s. And that whole idea, that framing of queer people as pedophiles, as dangers to children, and the way that has colored everything that has happened with LGBT youth for so long. Because basically what happened, largely because of Anita Bryant, was for a long time you had a lot of LGBT organizations that would not really touch on any issues involving kids because they did not want that stigma, to bring that back up. So as we were just talking about, LGBT youth for a long time, and probably at least to some degree today, a lot of people think they don't exist. Queer kids don't exist, and if they do, it's because they've been recruited or groomed.
Brainwashed.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, just starting with that idea of the kind of the discovery that queer youth actually do exist, the development of things like PFLAG, which was the organization for parents of lesbians and gays back in the 70s with Jean Manford, and then moving into the 80s and 90s with the creation of the first gay-straight alliances in schools, the creation of GLSEN, the nonprofit for inclusive LGBT schools, which grew straight out of the GSAs. And then, we move into, so we're going to start with that, and then, look at, the last 15, 20 years when you start seeing, at least some representation of LGBT youth in media and pop culture, starting with like Glee, for me is like a big one. That's like one of the first times you have like a queer teenage characters in a mainstream TV show. And we look at a lot of the, the pop culture of the last, decade and a half. And then also how, again, that has like interacted with these political conversations and these political attacks on, queer and trans kids, the attempts to ban books. We read the last couple of years in the class, I've had the students read Genderqueer by Maya Kobabe, the graphic novel, which has been the most banned book in America for the last, I think, 2 or 3 years now. Yeah. And we both read the book and talk about the book, which is a coming of age story about Kobabe coming out as asexual and non-binary. But then we also talk about the fact that it's the most banned book in America and, the controversy around that. So yeah, that's what I'm trying to do in the class is, give students a way to think about and talk about, these conversations, and looking at how the current, moral panics over trans kids and things like that, and the moral panics over banning books, can have a history. It's the same thing that Anita Bryant was doing in the 70s, and seeing the way that rhetoric just gets recycled.
But I also love, the fact that it's like things like Genderqueer can actually be published now. I can remember back in the day when the books were all talking about, a teen love story, someone's gonna die. Mm-hmm. So it's nice that we're actually getting away from those kind of tropes in those early kind of queer novels aimed at youth, and getting away from that and to a more positive be yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we talk about a lot in the class is like, those two things are connected together, right? We're in the space where, there are more, LGBT like young adult novels now than ever before, and more varied perspectives and varied types of stories. And that is exactly why we've had this, Moms for Liberty and this whole push of, book banning and stuff like that, is because we have this, the increasing diversity. That's what they're fighting against. Right. And same thing, the greater, we have greater, again, not perfect in all ways, but definitely greater representation, queer youth in general, trans people and trans youth than we had, 10 years ago. I just saw recently that, like, I think it's like this week, this month is the 10-year anniversary of that Time magazine transgender tipping point cover with Laverne Cox on the cover.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool.
Mhm.
That was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
That was 10 years ago.
Yeah. And then you think about that, like kind of again, and when you look at the history with Anita Bryant in the 70s, so that's in 2014, and then it's in 2019 that we see the beginning of this really organized anti-trans backlash. And that was kind of the same thing that happened in the 70s. You had the greater representation after Stonewall, and then you had the Anita Bryant backlash to that.
Right. So so exactly the same thing happening.
Yeah.
So what do you find when you're talking with the students? What do you find that they tend to gravitate towards? I mean, are there certain like events or things like, oh, I want to know more about that?
Mm-hmm. It varies so much with the students, which is what's really cool. But yeah, one thing I've definitely noticed is, as I mentioned earlier, they are very interested in the history. That is something I think when I first, like the early incarnations of the class in like 2019, when I was first teaching it, I think we focused a lot on, again, the contemporary media depictions, again, Glee, Love, Simon, Euphoria, Pose, all the media depictions. And we still talk about some of that, but the students really wanted to know about history when they learned about Anita Bryant and they learned about this stuff. And again, a lot of students come in. It's also a really interesting, often kind of split between the students. I often on the first day ask just like who has heard of Stonewall, and it tends to be about a 50-50 split. So you have those students who come into this class with at least some knowledge previously, often from, doing their own research online, things like that, or maybe they have some older, people in their life who have been able to like teach them about this stuff. And then you have the students who have nothing, and come in with like no frame of reference. And like I said, are really angry a lot of the time when they learn that there's all this history that they didn't know about. And yeah, then the things students gravitate towards, the final project is always to make a zine about sort of what they learned in the class, and it's up to them to decide what they want to do and what they want to focus on. And I've had them do all kinds of things. Had a zine last semester on the history of flowers as queer symbols, and like why lavender became associated with queer people and things like that. I had another student, I remember I mentioned offhand in class, it was not like a main thing we were talking about, but we got onto the history of disco and its relationship with the gay rights movement, which is like one of my favorite topics to talk about.
Cool.
Yeah. And I mentioned David Mancuso, who's the credited inventor of disco, with his loft parties in the 70s. And yeah, I had one student who got really interested in that. His final zine was all about David Mancuso, and he got the little glass tiles and did like a mirror ball thing on the front of the zine. It was really cool. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. So that's one of the really great parts about the class is allowing the students, that kind of entry point, and, to find out, what things they're interested in.
Do you find any of them then go off and publish their zine?
I haven't had any like publish, but I did have one student. So I just had last year, sort of, because it is a freshman class, all the students are freshmen. And so last year was my first like graduating class. Basically, the students I had who took that class as a freshman graduated as seniors last year. And one of the students, she basically took the zine that she did in the first class and did a larger, more elaborate version of it for her honors college thesis.
Very cool.
Yeah, which was really cool to see. So I do see that, a lot of them who like stick with that, and it sort of starts, a path of inquiry for them, which is really cool.
And I mean, you're right. I mean, even that touch into music, I mean, in the history of queer music, I mean, bringing in folks like Sylvester and
exactly.
So how do you broach the topic? A lot of times when you're looking at the media, you see one type. I mean, it's very focused in terms of who's actually represented. So how do you touch on that topic of marginalized communities and diversity.
Yeah, that's definitely something we talk about, and that's definitely something I'm very aware of. And when I'm, choosing the things that we're gonna watch or read and talk about, so yeah, one thing I try to do is, kind of be thoughtful with that. Before we started today, you and I were talking about the documentary Two Spirits, which is something I've shown in the class before because I think it's a great introduction to Two Spirit and Indigenous queer youth, and yeah, in terms of the books and stuff, I try to represent different voices, and that's also part of when I do the zine project at the end of the semester. One thing I tell them as they're thinking about the topic they want to do is, what is something you wanted to learn more about that I didn't cover, and things like that. And try to just basically acknowledge that, I'm not going to be able to include, every perspective, but just kind of being aware of that. And then, yeah, opening up to the students. And it's going to being very like, my approach to, the materials that I assign in class is not like, is opposite of the kind of the old school, like, here is the canon of things you need to know. Like, these are the important things. And I try to very much approach it as, here's a sampling, an introduction, so that you can then go off and figure out what you want to learn about and learn more.
Exactly, like whetting that appetite. So it's like, especially for those students who are coming in that don't have an inkling even about Stonewall.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
And to give you the foundation for what else is there, and to start asking that question. I mean, I think that's really one of the most important things, is to start questioning, oh, wait a minute, what history is here?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think, I think with queer history, I think that's really important because, like we talked about earlier, so people don't get it in schools, but then you also see, I think especially like on social media, especially this time of year when we're in Pride Month, and every social media influencer account does their posts, and you definitely see the same couple people and events pop up over and over again, and all, like, and especially like the media depictions, like, and you see Harvey Milk, you see Stonewall, you see like the same few folks, and trying to encourage people to, like, that's the starting point. There's so much more to learn, like, after that. Like,
right.
LGBT history is so unknown to people. They think, okay, Stonewall, Harvey Milk, Marsha P. Johnson, I'm good. Like, that's all. That's all.
Oh yeah, forget about
it's like we're on a loop of like Pride Month is just a rinse and repeat of like step one into like unpacking all of this, especially for straight people who are trying to get involved, and they do their thing during Pride Month, and then that's it.
Yeah, exactly. And then the next year, and then you just post the same Instagram slideshow with the same 5 historical figures again.
Yeah.
So how do we get out of that loop? I mean, because for me, I mean, I see that and I'm like, okay, and what's next? And so many times there's not a what's next.
That is the hard part, right? Because, and again, like, as a teacher, and then I'm sure, Marshall, you experience this, doing your presentations and speaking off to 2 very, mixed audiences, in terms of people that are not necessarily super well versed in this. So you're going to always have that person who, like, doesn't know about Stonewall, who is starting at square one. And so I think that is the challenge, and that, like you mentioned, the events we've been doing at Brick Road Coffee, that's something that we've been trying to do. And I think part of it there is because the audience at Brick Road Coffee is a large, like, queer audience. Like,
for sure.
We did our event last year, we focused on important historical figures, but we deliberately were like, we don't need to do Marsha P. Johnson and Harvey Milk. Like, our audience already knows those people.
Yeah.
So do the figures that are less well represented. So
we can move on to like 102.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we talked about Jose Sarria, the founder of the Imperial Court, first openly queer person to run for public office. Jean Manford, who founded PFLAG. BJ Budd. We talked about those kind of figures. And then this year, actually, we're focusing on queer spaces. And so, we talked about last week the Castro Theater and how it was important both as like a symbol of, the Castro and the queer community in San Francisco, but also it hosted the first ever, LGBT film festival. And it hosted the premiere of Trisha's Wedding, the Coquettes movie with Sylvester in it, and like created like queer film as a thing. This week we talked about the Jules Catch One in LA, Black queer nightclub that was one of the hubs of disco, speaking of disco. So that was kind of my thing this year was like, let's even move away from people and individuals, because so much of our history tends to focus on that, there's what's called the great man theory, and even when it's not a man, even if it's a woman or non-binary person, still like that great individual, and moving away from the focus on individuals to communities and places and spaces and things like that.
Well, and actually, and that's actually a trend going on right now. I mean, there was just a Zoom chat countrywide talking about preserving LGBTQ spaces. New York has started doing that. You have Stonewall now being named a national monument.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. You've got the bar in Hollywood that has now been preserved. And so I think it's like, it also begs the question of, even if there's no building, there's still a history. So that's why if you walk along Roosevelt and you look on the north side of the street at 2nd Street, you'll find a plaque in the sidewalk for the old 307.
Oh, cool.
And so talking about that drag history and that safe space so even though there's no building there.
Yeah. And that's why I think that's like incredibly important to, have that marker of the 307. And especially, I know I've heard you talk about this in some of your presentations. It's something I've been talking about with the events at Brick Road, where the title of kind of the theme for this year is, we called it the invisible map, which is a term that I borrowed from Michael Bronski, the historian who wrote the Queer History of the United States. And he talked about, the invisible map as cities developed in the 20th century, and gay neighborhoods developed alongside them. Gay neighborhoods had to be, invisible to the straight community and usually to the law, because, it was illegal to have gay bars. But then, signal to the intended audience. And, the ways that they did that, and the ways that, a big part of joining, a queer community was finding someone who could tell you where to go, like what the bars were, because they weren't advertised that way. And so, and so that's like a place like the 307 Lounge, like a lot of these, older queer spaces, like obviously were not advertised as gay bars, or queer spaces. So unearthing that history, which is, I know what you've been doing, Marshall, a lot with like oral history and things like that, is, the only way to really learn that.
Right. And I think, and really, it's even with like the 307, and I think that's part of why it's still the 307, because that was the original address, and then moved to 222, but still kept that original address, because there was no newspaper. It's like, hey, your favorite queer space is now relocating. So that was exactly they could do it, was to keep the name, even though it was a different location.
Yeah, we talked about that at Brick Road this weekend with so Jose Saria's bar in San Francisco in the 40s and 50s was called the Black Cat, and it became very well known, as a gay bar. It was probably the most well-known gay bar. And then in the 60s in LA, a bar called the Black Cat opened, which was not affiliated, but they chose that name because that signaled like, this is a gay bar, because the Black Cat, that's what the Black Cat was known for. And in the 70s, in the 70s in Tucson, there was a bar called the Stonewall. And there were, in other cities in the 70s, there were bars called Stonewall that started popping up because that's a way to signal to your target audience.
Right. That here's who frequents our bar as well.
Very cool.
And so, and I think, and you start talking about even that coded language. I mean, like, I can remember growing up, and Thursday was Green Jeans Day, where if you wore green jeans on Thursday, that meant you were gay.
Oh, wow.
So it's like, you best believe I was out there buying myself some green jeans as soon as I heard that, and wearing them on Thursday.
Dyeing your denim.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, and so many things were designed to protect the community. I mean, it was like house parties were huge.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and so when you talk about queer spaces, I'm actually getting ready to start working on a presentation about Ray Bourbon and those drag albums that were really big in the 40s and 50s. And it's basically for a group of commercial architecture fans. So it's really looking at some of those spaces and the history behind those spaces.
Yeah.
And so many of those marginalized communities, it's like, regardless of the community, were in not necessarily the best neighborhoods. So the buildings weren't well maintained. Some of them survive, some of them don't survive. So, and I think that's what's unique about when you look at LGBTQ history is it's like, it doesn't meet the same litmus test as mainstream communities.
Yeah, that's like, talking about drag history. I've read about, sort of like the history of lip syncing and how lip syncing became associated with drag performers. And like, seems like the general consensus is like, no one really knows exactly why or like how, who the first drag performer was to lip sync or anything like that. But one of the theories as to why it became so prevalent was basically gay bars were small and you couldn't fit a band in there. So like the only way you could do entertainment was having a performer lip sync to the jukebox.
Oh, that's funny. So it would have taken quarters or nickels, I guess, at that point to request songs.
Yeah, because that was the thing. That was, back then you had like the bars where you could go hear live music, and then like the smaller, usually, more downscale bars that just had a jukebox, and and those were the gay bars.
Wow, I'd never heard that connection between jukebox and lip syncing. And so very cool. Yeah, no, I mean, it's like with Rusty Warren, it's like, that's why I was excited. So one of my favorite sites is Queer Music Heritage.
Yes, I love them.
Oh my gosh. I mean, it's such a great site. I mean, it's like, you can tell he spent so much time researching and that's the fun thing. I've like hearing the whole pansy craze. I mean, being able to identify the music of different eras and those connections to political movements, social movements.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I love Queer Music Heritage. I think that's where I first learned like of Jackie Shane, for example. And I don't know if you saw Jackie Shane is getting a new documentary that's actually premiering at the San Francisco Queer Film Festival later this month. Is getting a lot of really great reviews. And that's a great example of a figure that, a decade ago was almost entirely lost to history, getting this great revival. And Jackie Shane, for listeners who aren't familiar, was a Black trans soul singer in the mid 60s, who had a series of, kind of minor hits, but never really made it to the big time. And a large part of that was her trans identity. There's a story that she was invited to perform on the Ed Sullivan Show, but they told her she had to do it in men's clothing and she refused. And then a few years later, she quit the music business altogether, and disappeared for 30 years, more or less. So yeah, like seeing all those figures be rediscovered. Yeah, Jasmine, like you were saying earlier, it's great that I think we're getting into the 102 level now, of these other great figures.
Yeah, totally. So in your classes, obviously there's youth that are learning about this queer history for the first time, and there's a sadness or a heaviness to it to know that, it used to be much more dangerous to be queer identifying. So for students who are learning it for the first time and maybe are queer identifying themselves, like how do they kind of process those? Do you see them processing it live? Is there some kind of positivity that's then surged into it of like realizing the place that we're now at? And I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is some of that, but then also, and I think, in the 5 years I've been teaching the class, there's also been a change because of this, kind of political moment that we're in.
Right.
That 5 years ago, I think there was more of that of, look how far we've come, things have changed, and being grateful for that. But now, again, it's more just like,
kind of backtracking.
Yeah, again, especially reading about Anita Bryant and like all the backlash in the 70s, just being like, oh, this is everything that's happening right now. It's just familiar.
Yeah.
And we do have a lot of, I have a lot of students in that class who come from, from small towns, communities that were not accepting. So, for them in high school, it wasn't necessarily much different, and from their perspective, than 40 or 50 years ago, unfortunately. And I've even seen that from students sometimes who will often get upset about like there is like a media narrative of like things are so much better now, and they're like, well, it wasn't for me growing up in Maricopa, like I've definitely heard that too.
Well, and I think
story.
Yeah, and I think it's different. It's not better, it's not worse, it's different.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And
absolutely.
But I think it is for the students at the end, like, and just learning that there is a history at the end of the day is very like affirming, and
for sure.
Seeing themselves as like part of that, history and tradition, that I think is really powerful for them.
Yeah. And where do you find like topics of the intersectionality within the community and the history as well? Like that feels especially prevalent today of like a trans youth experience could be a lot different than, somebody coming out as gay or lesbian. And even the lesbian, like myself, I find it difficult to relate to like gay men. And like they still have maybe like a cis white male experience, whereas I'm like a woman of color also coming out as gay.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. I think one thing it's good about having the class and having space to talk about things. So even like, we'll watch something like Love, Simon, and we'll have like a lot of thoughts on it, and a lot of feedback on exactly those things of like, this is about a upper middle class, like cis white
right,
like, sure, it's
also
fine.
Pretty.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he's also like a skinny little
and he's like popular,
conventionally attractive.
Yeah. Right. And I think my students are very like attuned to the problems of that, and so I think that's good. And I think students today, when you talk about things like intersectionality, so this is one of these things that I think actually older people more my age have more trouble with than the younger people do. The younger people like just understand it a lot better. And same thing with like, gender identity and things like that.
Absolutely.
They're just very sort of, used to that, which is really great to see. And they don't understand why older people have trouble with it. They just, it just makes sense. Something that's great about the students is that they are willing to engage in that way, engage in kind of with a critical lens. And see the voices that are not being represented as well. And like Love, Simon, for example, is an example of one. I haven't even done that one in a couple of years because my students just would, like, even though it's like not that old of a movie, it feels very old fashioned already.
When did it come out?
I was like, I think 2017 or 2018.
Yeah, I didn't even go see it. I was in college when it came out, and I didn't even go see it.
Was like, even when it came out, I remember it already feeling a little outdated, which is a lot with a lot of representation, especially in films and stuff like that, is that they're always playing catch up, to the wider term.
What was the movie that? There was the one movie that came out that was like heralded as like the new gay sitcom movie. He had a museum out in New York.
Oh, Bros.
I kept thinking Brothers. I'm like, Brothers isn't right. So Bros.
Close. Yeah.
I mean, lots of red flags in that movie, but there was a lot. I mean, the thing I appreciate about that movie was there was lots of history in that movie.
Yeah. Yeah, I was like, movie about someone who like hosts a gay history podcast. I'm there,
Right, exactly.
But it was, and that's,
that's cool.
that movie kind of is an example of what I was talking about earlier. Of like a large part of that movie is Billy Eichner's character as a cis white gay man, like learning intersectionality, you know. And that's what I mean when I say like my students, you know, aren't going through that same process. The way
they just like innately can wrap their heads around it.
Yeah, they aren't being dragged kicking and screaming into acknowledging that like cis white gay men aren't the center of the universe, you know.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, even as like I've been especially aware of it in the differences between like being gay, lesbian, pansexual, bisexual, and then having a gender non-conforming identity. I'm like, I can't, you know, really say that I have some relatability or significant experience to build community with a person who has a gender non-conforming identity. Like I'm a cis woman, and I think me coming out as lesbian was a lot different than the process that trans people go through. And like that is its own thing, even though of course any queerness is like going to be community building in and of itself, but there is still differences there. Like I just recently had a good friend come out as trans, and it like brought me back to like, oh, when I came out, I'm like, wait, that's not relatable. Like it's not same.
Yeah, I think that's what, you know, we come back to a lot in the class, is especially when you're talking about like representation and like media and culture, like the answer is always more, you know, like, you know, more and diverse perspectives and voices. Like, you know, the representation in like Love, Simon wouldn't be as annoying if there were 100 other movies about queer teenagers that were about, you know, a Black trans teenager, and, you know, like, and every other, you know, different representations. But it's like when that's like the one gay movie, you know, that's when it becomes a problem.
For sure. Yeah, that's a really good way to put it.
So how did your class react when you came in and told them about the experience you had being accosted?
Yeah, it was really interesting the way all of that played out last fall. Because like I said, we had talked about it in class. We had, you know, like, I think it's the second week of the class, I do my, like, the Anita Bryant unit. We talk about Save Our Children. And it was actually the students had brought up Turning Point USA, because, you know, if you're familiar with them, a big part of their whole thing is they have a large presence on college campuses. You know, and they, you know, and for folks who aren't not familiar, they're a group that claims to be a conservative student organization, a thing to, you know, rally conservative, you know, college students to vote, et cetera, are actually a white nationalist recruiting organization. They're a hate group. And yeah, so they came up, the students brought them up initially, actually. And so we talked about that. And then it was a couple weeks after that, before the thing happened in October, when I was put on the Turning Point's professor watch list, which is their famous, you know, list of professors who are indoctrinating, you know, the students. I had like, prior to that, I had been for a while, like half jokingly talking about how I was not on that list, which I was half jokingly saying I was a little offended by, you know, just, but
yeah, you're like, give me some credit.
Yeah, exactly. Like I felt I was, you know, being ignored, but then also pointed out to them, like, no, it's better to not be on there. And then this was like 2 weeks later, then everything happens. And yeah, so then the incident happened. One of my students actually, because it happened right after that class, I was walking, if you know the video, I was walking out of that class when the thing happened. A student of mine from the class actually saw what happened and came over and helped me out. They're the one who called 911. So they were kind of in the middle of it, unfortunately, which and so, you know, I've talked with them quite a bit since then, one-on-one, to, you know, make sure they're doing all right. They were great. And then, yeah, so I first emailed the students, because it was going to be a week before we had class again, because it was a once-a-week class. You know, told them what happened, and then the following week's class, you know, we canceled the normal what was planned, and sat down and had a conversation. And we just sort of came back to, this is everything we've been discussing. And they were very upset. They were very angry about it, obviously. But I think for them, it was just, made what we were talking about very real, and made like the stakes of it very real for them. But then, we were able to move on, and, I think it was a really great class overall.
Good.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I can only imagine what the students must have been going through, and especially that student that was there and watching it as it unfolded.
Yeah, I know that must have been really difficult.
Then what was the response from the university where it happened?
I'm gonna choose my words carefully here.
I know, that's why I was like, okay, so
Oh,
yeah.
no.
So this is what I will say. As this before, like, many of the people in the administration, up to and including Michael Crow, especially right after it happened, were very supportive of me, very upset that it happened. I talked to Michael Crow personally, like the day after it happened. He called me up, and he was angry, which was very strange, because if you know Michael Crow, like, him expressing emotion is kind of strange. He is usually very,
Right.
measured when you see him publicly. So yeah, he was generally very upset. A lot of the administration has been very supportive of me personally, and making sure, I get the support that I need and things like that. Where we've, run into a problem is, Turning Point USA has a student club on campus, that they sponsor. There's a, Turning Point at ASU student club, like there are for a lot of these political groups. And they are still an active student group as of now, still getting, money from ASU to do their events like any other student group. There has been a push to have them removed from campus entirely because of, this incident, but that has not yet happened. The criminal case against the two involved was wrapped up, about a month ago. We'll see if anything happens now that they have now admitted guilt, and all of that. But that is still the thing that and I know a lot of other people in the community at ASU would like to see, is an actual move to like start removing these groups from campus. That, we understand the idea of like protecting free speech, but like this is not protecting free speech at this point. This is, you're protecting hate speech. You're creating an unsafe environment for your LGBT faculty and students, and your students and faculty of color who these groups also attack quite frequently. And we'd like to see ASU really take the lead. And again, that's the thing. President Crow and ASU, since the incident happened, have done that verbally, have been very, given interviews in the media and spoken very strongly against, Turning Point and, these things. But like, we need actual action now, to back that up. And that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah,
so one of the things that's kind of coming up in this conversation is kind of the chasm between kind of the experienced community and then the younger community.
Mm-hmm.
How do we go about trying to bridge that? Because I think there are things to learn on both sides of the aisle, that it's not just a history lesson for one side, but I think there's also, here's what's going on, and it is a different experience now. But how do we try to bridge that gap?
That's something I've been thinking about a lot. And I think like that's the next step and next thing, things I want to focus on and work on, is creating spaces for, those generations to intermingle. And like you said, I think one thing is for it to not be a one-sided thing. Like I mentioned earlier, like I think a lot of students are hungry for this history, but then, as I said, I think there are some of the younger people who, when they talk to older queer people, and the older queer people are going on and on about, oh, you guys have it like so great now, back in our day, things were so much worse. And I think some of the younger people can get put off a little by that,
Definitely.
And so kind of moving past that, and moving into, like really good like two-way conversations, the generations learning from each other. Yeah, I don't know what that looks like, but this is like the thing that I would like, to work on creating is spaces for those, older and younger people to get together. Because yeah, I think there's a lot to share on both sides and to learn from on both sides. And I think there are younger people who want to learn this, and there are, a lot of older queer people who want to tell people. I think there are a lot of, especially, folks, queer people in kind of the generation before mine. I was born in 1981. So I'm, part of the generation that kind of came post the AIDS epidemic, but especially those folks who came up, generation previous to me, because we lost so many people. The people who lived through that really want to share and preserve that history because they know how important it is and to be lost. And so, yeah, I don't know. I know, Marshall, you and I have talked about, working together on some projects in the future. I think this is the next project we need to work on, is figure out how to do that, how to get older and younger people to get together and have coffee and talk,
Yeah.
Right. It was funny. So I was recently up in Flagstaff doing some art things and stumbled across a mural they have called Unity that is partially organized and funded and prepped by Flagstaff Pride. It's on the back of the Orpheum, kind of in an awkward position where it's not very visible. And it's like, and then you look at Phoenix and I'm like, okay, we now have Chef Silvana as a queer Latina with a mural. There are the wings on Stacy's bar. And I'm like, where is our queer representation in murals? And so I'm also kind of wondering, it's like, is there a thing there? Because there are enough stories. I think there are enough of some of those larger icons. I mean, James Baldwin being on the 1000 or the 1001 building, but most people I've talked to, and they're like, who is that guy? Why is he there? And so going into a little bit of the history of who he was, and they're like, oh, okay.
Right. And then even people who know James Baldwin, like, often don't know that he was gay.
Right.
So yeah,
how do you? I'm like, how do you know about James Baldwin not knowing he was gay? Oh my gosh!
Yeah, the number of people who have like told about Giovanni's Room, like these people who know James Baldwin, they know The Fire Next Time, and his writings on race and things like that, but never heard of Giovanni's Room, and didn't know that he published one of the first gay novels. It's a lot of people, unfortunately.
Well, and I love that, like, Giovanni's Room as a bookstore still survives in Philadelphia, and now is kind of a nonprofit thing, because I think bookstores can be so tenuous in terms of turning a profit. But as a safe space, I can remember going there and just being, oh my gosh! I mean, it was I kind of miss gay bookstores. Yeah,
and that's one thing with the series we've been doing at Brick Road. When I, set out to do it, I was like, okay, I don't want them to all be bars. You could very easily do, 5 famous gay bars.
Yeah.
Different kinds of spaces. We did the Castro Theater. We're later this month, talk about the Oscar Wilde Bookshop in New York, which Craig Rodwell started in the 60s. And was basically the first gay bookstore. And, we have a few, Tucson has Antigone Books, which is fantastic. A great, old school feminist bookstore, which also has a lot of great, LGBT representation. And yeah, like that's one of those things that we need more of, especially here in the Valley, are those kind of spaces.
Well, because when you talk about education, I mean, even just reading through the shelves of some of those bookstores is an education in itself, just because it's like, oh, I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't know that. So.
Oh yeah, I mean, a big part of my, education was going to Changing Hands, and going to their LGBT section, which, back in the day, this is when, when I was at ASU 20 years ago, I'd go to Changing Hands. They had a shelf that was LGBT, and then like the women's studies shelf was underneath it. And it was like one tiny little shelf, but that was like more than any other bookstore had, and I bought the Celluloid Closet there. Vito Russ's book about the history of I bought Quentin Crisp's book, How to Be a Virgin. Quentin Crisp was this great dandy of the early 20th century. And yeah, and like, you know, that was great, but again, I had the one shelf, you know, and so having, you know, a whole bookstore, you know, having spaces dedicated like that, I think that's, yeah, so important.
You know, maybe that's a piece of it, is maybe doing a pop-up almost like a bookstore, even if the books aren't for sale. I don't know, because I mean, there's so many titles that share so many stories.
I mean, one of my like big dreams, if, you know, someone gave us, you know, some huge amount of money or something, is a Drag Story Hour bookmobile.
Oh, yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. You know, we talked about, oh, actually, we do just have in New York, one of our national staff members just set up the first Drag Story Hour branded little free library at his house. And that's another idea we've talked about, is doing more, rolling out more of those, having people do specifically, you know, Drag Story Hour little free libraries that specifically carry, you know, queer books, you know, things like that. And so I think those are some ideas, but yeah, like I would love to have, you know, a queer focused bookstore here in Phoenix. I'd love to have more spaces like a Brick Road Coffee that are, you know, not, you know, bars that are all ages, that people can come and hang out and meet other people and things like that.
Right.
So yeah.
I mean, like Trunk's Place just closing. I mean, I love Trunk's Space because their stage was open to anybody. And so I'm excited to see kind of their next irradiation of where they go. But it's a missed stage because it was underage, and so many folks took to the stage for the first time there.
Yeah, those all ages spaces I think are so important. Whether it's bookstore, music venue, you know, all those kind of places. And you know, going back to what we talked about at the beginning, this, you know, kind of idea that, you know, queer youth like basically don't exist, you know, that, you know, queer adults, you know, exist, but, you know, they come out of, you know, this mysterious space. And, you know, part of that is, traditionally the spaces you could go into were adults only spaces, you know, they were 21 and over. And so, yeah, having those kind of like all ages spaces.
It's so important.
Yeah. And there is like, you know, again, that's also the cool thing about learning about history, is like reading that there are, you know, examples of that. There's like, you know, the Hetrick Martin Institute in New York has been, you know, working with queer youth and providing like educational spaces for queer youth like since the early 80s. You know, once again, learning that like it's not all new. You know, I think that's the thing, is like we think about these kind of things that we have to like reinvent the wheel, but that's just because when you actually learn the history, like, oh no, people have actually already done this. Like it is already there, but we just have not, you know, learned about it.
Right. And I think you're right. I think it's not necessarily recreating the wheel, but just looking and see what's been done before and how do we improve upon that. And be more inclusive.
Make it more accessible and more widely known.
Yeah, that's the thing. When you look at these spaces, like all of them have, you know, issues, but then you take that, you build on it, you try to make it better.
Yeah.
So what else do you have coming up at Brick Road Coffee?
So we have the events on Saturday for the rest of the month, these next 3 weeks. Actually, Marshall, I was going to email you if you are free on Saturday and you want to come join us. We're actually going to talk about the 307 Lounge. And talk a little about some local history. I know you're busy this month, but if you are free.
What time?
5 to 7.
That may actually work because this weekend is also Juneteenth. And so I know I'm doing a thing earlier that day.
Oh, cool.
So a 5 to 7 time slot would work.
Great. All right.
Can I also mention Case Happy Landing Buffet?
Yes.
Our first lesbian bar?
Yes.
Okay.
I actually was like, I wanted to do a local space and I was like debating between those two. And I went with the 307 because it's like more well-known and there's the marker and everything.
Right. There's actually something to talk about and see, as opposed to with K's. It's like there's some ads in the newspaper and that's about it.
Yeah. But I you know, you're the one who introduced me to Case Happy Landing Buffet and I love it. And yeah, so that's the space I wish we, knew more about.
And we could also even, go into the discussion just about places and how many queer spaces don't survive.
Yeah. And that was going to be, what I want to talk about on Saturday as well, focusing on the local history, is like archiving and preservation, the importance of, keeping flyers and buttons and, and things like that, so we're going to talk about that as well on Saturday. But yes, we're doing that on Saturday. The following Saturday on June 22nd, our featured space is actually the Pagoda. Are you familiar with the Pagoda, the lesbian commune in St. Augustine, Florida?
I'm not, but I'm quite in. So do you also include Apache Junction in that with its lesbian trailer parks?
Yes. Well, so
I always have to bring it back to that local that Arizona connection. It's like, I'm like, if you're talking about that, you should be talking about this.
Well, and again, as I said, the whole idea is, these are introduction. These are kind of the appetizers, so you learn more about it. And I wanted to do a lesbian commune specifically, because I think that is, or like these lesbian spaces, because I think they're important. And they were, there was the whole movement, especially in the 70s, these lesbian communes and lesbian land and things like that. And a lot of them survived for a long time, and some of them still survive today. There are some that are still, in operation. But the Pagoda is a particularly interesting one, and there was just recently a book published on it. It was an old beach resort in St. Augustine, Florida, with a bunch of little bungalows and then like a big house on the beach. And these pair of lesbian couples first wanted to just rent the house for their lesbian feminist theater company. But then they ended up also buying the bungalows. And then taking over this entire little, I think it was like 8 bungalows overall. And there was an operation from 1977 to 1999. And they had like basically a, covenant agreement that, all of the lesbian couples who own these bungalows would only sell to other lesbians if they moved out. And a lot of them would also like rent their bungalows as vacation spaces when they weren't there to other lesbians. So you had a lot of people who would come, for a weekend to visit. You had these feminist musicians like Alex Dobkin, or these like nationally known musicians, would come and perform there. This was the same time as like the Michigan Women's Festival and, a lot of those things. And yeah, I think it's a really fascinating story. They had they were incorporated as a church. They were the Pagoda Goddess of Love Church. And they did,
amazing.
Tarot. And so friend of mine is going to do a little tarot workshop as part of that presentation. So yeah, it's gonna be on the 22nd. It'll be a lot of fun. And then on the 29th, as we mentioned, we're gonna talk about the Oscar Wilde bookstore. And also that night, Brick Road Coffee is actually launching a queer literary magazine, and that's gonna be the launch party for the magazine as well.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So in the midst of talking about like the Pagoda, are you talking about like Casa Suzanne, which was the famous trans or cross-dressing kind of encampment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely want to like mention that as well and bring those up. Like I said, like,
well, right, and I think that there's so many where it's like there's so much that it's kind of like, oh my god, how do we weed this out and make it actually?
Yeah, I mean, there's also I'll tell. This is a place I can tell this story. So I've been doing this research on the lesbian communes in particular. There is basically one book that's been written on the subject called Lesbian Land by this writer Joyce Chaney. Have you heard of this at all?
I've not, but I'm so intrigued by just that title, Lesbian Land.
So this is a book that was published in 1985, which was basically, so in the early 80s, a lot of these communes were starting to disappear. They started in the 70s, and then by the 80s, people were moving out. Like I said, some of them survived, some of them are still active today, but a lot of them were starting to disappear. So this author basically asked members of these different communes around the country to contribute like their histories, their stories. And yeah, she has these like basically oral histories of, I think it's about 40 different lesbian communes around the country. There's Arizona, New Mexico, upstate New York, Oregon, There's a commune that was specifically for disabled lesbians. And there were, some that were for people of color specifically. But this book was published by a small feminist press in 1985 and has gone out of print. And when I went to buy a copy, there's a copy on eBay currently selling for $3,000 because it's so rare. So I was able to get this.
Oh my God.
Yeah, through interlibrary loan through ASU. This is from Ohio State
Yay,
University.
interlibrary loan.
Yes, interlibrary loan is amazing. But yeah, this thing but this is how endangered these stories are. This book is almost impossible to find now, and that tells these stories. And so, like I said, with the the end of Brick Road, we're going to talk about the pagoda, going to focus on it. But again, as just an entry point to talk about how there's this whole chapter of history is something that very few people know about today.
Right. Wow. I have a feeling we could go on and on and on.
Mm-hmm.
So, David, thank you. Do you have anything else, Jasmine, that you want to bring up?
Oh my gosh, no.
Are you booking a trip now to the pagoda?
I think I am. I think I have to.
I just say the pagoda now.
I'm like bookmarking these things.
The pagoda, unfortunately, it's like the buildings are still there, but it did get sold off eventually piece by piece. And apparently now they're just pretty generic Airbnbs now. You can rent them, but they're not like the pagoda like it used to be.
Yeah. They're not like a museum.
Yeah.
That's really sad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately.
So, well, David, thank you so much. How can people find out more about Drag Story Hour?
Drag Story Hour AZ on Instagram is probably our best place to follow us there. You can go to our website. You can sign up for our newsletter there as well. Just follow us on social media. I would say if you are interested in bringing a drag story hour to your, event or library or, school or anything like that, you can reach out to us. My email is david@dragstoryhour.org. You can, our organization emails on the website. I have to say, especially over the last, year and a half, as we've had this increase in, the right-wing pushback and hate and violence and things like that. One of our big issues now is, finding places to perform. So if people are interested in having us come, even if it's a private event, we're open for that as well. Birthday party, something like that. Reach out to us, let us know. We'll definitely work with you because we want to bring more events in more places all over Arizona. We, want to, as best possible, to go out, to the small towns as well. So we're going to Bisbee this week. Want to go elsewhere. So reach out to us. Follow us on Instagram. We have I don't think we use our Facebook anymore, so don't follow us on Facebook. I don't know if you still use Facebook. Instagram, I think, is the one we use now. So yeah,
I say that's usually the popular one is all the Instagram.
Yeah.
So. All right. Well, David, thank you so much for joining us and sharing an obvious passion of yours, which is that history. And yes, we definitely do need to work together to try and bridge that gap. Mm-hmm. And Jasmine will be pulling you into that conversation as well. So
I wish I could take your class.
That's actually another thing on the agenda, is because people have said that of finding a way to do the class outside of the school, outside of ASU.
Yeah.
Community members. So that might be in the works at some point too.
I will stay tuned. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's so rare to find, well, I don't want to say it's so rare, but it's special to find, queer adults to relate to and learn from in a non-judgmental format. Like you even just explaining simply and neutrally the difference, the split amongst your students, not knowing Stonewall, and that's not something that you gawk at even. It's that's very special.
Yeah, that's such a great point.
Maintain that type of space.
That's definitely something I've seen, you don't know what Stonewall is, as if it's a personal failing, on the person.
Yeah, and it's not their fault.
Yeah.
that's actually like an example of like, look, we need to be like talking about these things and making sure that we are maintaining the history and everyone's learning about this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, so I will stay tuned. Thank you so much. It was great to talk with you.
All right. Well, I guess this is to be continued because, so David, look forward to chatting more as well as with Jasmine, and maybe we can figure something out. Maybe we can do an online virtual class or something along that lines. So, let's see what we can do. All right. Well, I think that is it for today. So thank you all for joining us for Arizona LGBTQ plus story time. Community history. Have a great day, all.
Woo.